Blasting President Trump's big, beautiful bill on X, calling it a disgusting abomination of pork-filled congressional spending that will burden Americans with crushingly unstable debt. And as we reported just a moment ago, the CBO out with their estimate saying that the tax cut and budget bill would add $2.4 trillion to the national debt. Well, our next guest has a brand new book out this week all about the topic of debt, and it is making the rounds in Washington. It's called How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle. And joining us now is the author, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater, one of the world's largest hedge funds. Ray, it's good to have you. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
So is the U.S. going broke?
Yeah. The reason I wrote the book is that for about the last 50 years, I've been an investor who has bet on bond markets, and I've been through plenty of these debt crises. They happen over and over, and they're not understood mechanistically. So the book, the purpose of the book is to explain the mechanics of how this happens as it applies to the United States. And so I'd love to just take a minute and explain the mechanics of how that happens, if I can.
Yes. I mean, we do. We get the headlines every day on the high debt and growing debt load. So tell us what we need to be aware of.
Yeah. In other words, why now, not another time? Is this a false warning? What happens? Okay, I just want to convey that. There are three things that happen. When you could think of the credit system for the government as being very similar to your own credit system, or if you're running a company, what it's like to run a company in debt, except for two different things. They can print the money and they can take the money from you through taxes. But the economics, the debt is basically the same way. And so think of the circulatory system like there's this great circulatory system that brings credit to people. And then if they use that credit well, they produce profits, and the profits pay for it. And so if debt is rising relative to income, that's a problem. And so what happens is mechanistically is first that as debt and debt service rise, then the debt service, the interest rate and the debt payments increase and squeeze out spending. And so you're seeing that. In other words, you're seeing, I'll go into the numbers in a second. I'll just get the three forces. The second force is a buying and selling. In other words, the one man's debts are another man's assets. So they're holding these bonds. There's so many people who are holding bonds around the world, the debt holders. And that they then take those bonds, and if they now have to buy a lot of other bonds because we're selling those bonds. Not only is there a supply-demand problem now, if I actually calculate who are the buyers of those, there's a reducing demand relative to the supply. And if you get into a position where they have to then worry about those bonds, they could sell those bonds. So the amount to be sold, it can be much greater even than the amount of the new debt that's being produced, and there's a supply-demand problem. So the second factor is the supply-demand, and the third is when that supply-demand problem happens, either interest rates go up or the central bank comes in and prints money. So if we go through those numbers, I can take you through them pretty quickly. You can see the position of the U.S. and the problem emerging.
Right. No, and all good issues, and I think it's why you have people like Jamie Dimon coming out and saying we're heading toward a debt crisis, and why Elon Musk is so worried about the debt. The biggest question I have, Ray, is how urgent of an issue is this? Are we actually seeing evidence about what you're talking about happening?
Yes, it's urgent. It's urgent because we are on the brink of the supply-demand. Just to put it in perspective, imagine you're running an enterprise, a company. You're spending $7 trillion a year. You're taking in $5 trillion. You have a $2 trillion deficit. You have a debt that's 6 times the amount of money that you're taking in. The interest on the debt is $1 trillion. That's 20% of all your spending and 50% of your deficit. And you can't cut the costs materially. You can't cut the costs because Social Security, all of these things
Sure,
are
it's
not.
political.
Okay, so you have a real problem. You're at a juncture.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You're at a juncture where you have to borrow money to pay your costs. That means that you're at this point where as the debt then compounds on the debt, and it's squeezing out. It's 50% of the deficit. So it's going to squeeze out. You'll have a supply-demand problem. So if we go another year and a year after that, which is probable, it's probable that nothing materially will be done until after the midterm elections. You're going to then have a different set of circumstances. You have more debt that you have to compound, still no plan to deal with that debt, and you have a political situation. Should you have a recession, it worsens, because the recession not only makes people more confrontational, but it also raises the budget deficit. It's the biggest influence in the budget deficit. So it's very urgent to be able to deal with this consideration now. It was dealt with well. There was a cut of 5% of GDP. If they can cut from the targeted 7% of GDP to about 3% of GDP, in other words, a cut of about 4% of GDP, not only are they going to have budget benefits, but they'll have lower interest rates, which contributes to better balance. That was done between 1991 and 1998. So there's a path here. I call it the 3%, three-part solution. 3%, get the deficit down to 3% of GDP. Spread it out. That means you probably have to change revenue and taxes, tax revenue and expenditure by about 4%. Squeeze in 4%. And if they do that, they will have probably a 1 to 1.5% decline from interest rates, and that will reduce the deficit by nearly another 2%. And that would be the path. That's what I call the 3%, three-part solution. On both sides of Congress, I've spoken both sides, agree on the numbers and agree on the mechanics.
No, even Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, talks about 3% deficit to GDP. I mean, they want to go there, but they're trying to pass a bill that adds $2.4 trillion over the next decade to national debt.
So what it's like is it's like being on a ship in which everybody agrees that if you don't turn a course, and whether you go left or right, if you have this, don't get to the 3%, you're probably going to hit the rocks. And what you have is a political conflict about arguing over how to cut the debt, how to cut the deficit and do it. And this chance is passing us by.
So it sounds like you would like to see the Fed actually lower interest rates because the interest on that debt is so much and has gotten to such high levels, more than defense spending. Is that something that would help?
You can't unnaturally lower interest rates without a negative consequence. Think of it this way. A bondholder wants a certain interest rate, and that's measured by the real interest rate. And if you artificially lower the interest rate, then what you're going to have is the problem that it's a worse asset to hold. And that can be a problem. But if you change the supply-demand picture the way I'm describing to lower the interest rate, then that's a healthy way of lowering the interest rate. You don't get richer by lowering interest rates or printing money. So you have to deal with this in a balanced way, the way it was done really between 1991 and 98 as a general example. In the book, I give several examples of how to do it in this balanced way.
Do you think that the dollar's reserve currency status is genuinely threatened right now by this fact and by the risks you're laying out?
Yes. A debt and a currency Currency is a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. We store it in a debt. And if there's a depreciation in the value of the currency, there's a depreciation in the value of the debt. And because there's a need, because there's this problem and these imbalances and so on, this is a big issue. So the depreciation of the dollar is making, and the expectation of a depreciation of the dollar makes it less attractive to hold that. Now, there are by the way, most countries around the world right now are dealing with this. Europe has a debt problem. Japan has a debt problem. China has a debt problem. So what happens is that all of these countries have this problem and will probably depreciate their currencies in a sense together, very similar to the 1970s. While the dollar in the 1970s fell against the alternative currencies, and it's probably likely that this happens again, you also have all the currencies falling in relationship to gold, goods and services, and so on, and then you can have an inflation. The problem you also have to worry about is when the government, the Federal Reserve, buys the debt, it takes a position in that debt. When it starts to lose money in that debt, then it has losses. It can have a negative net worth. That's the situation now. Then you get into the need to monetize the debt. These are the things to be careful about, and that's why it's been repeatedly. In this book, I covered 35 examples of the mechanics. And so that's the mechanics that we're dealing with.
So it's clear, you make it very clear what politicians need to do, and I think that they will find this book helpful, and hopefully they'll be able to get a hold of it. What about investors? I mean, it sounds like you're making the case for gold here and why you've liked it for a long time as a diversifying asset. But what should investors do? Should they stay away from U.S. bonds? I mean, we did see the 30-year yield cross 5%. I wonder if that's an indication that the dynamic is changing.
Investors need to have a diversified game plan. I'm not trying to get them to time the markets and move in and out and so on. The most important thing is that they have a well-diversified game plan. My own view would be that debt is going to be a problem. We have too much debt. We're going to get a lot more debt. So debt assets as a general thing is something to be worried about. But don't go whole hog in anything. But it is true that if you were to take a balanced portfolio and say, does gold serve as a diversifier? I think it's going to be a good asset, but it also is a diversifying asset, not a lot. Maybe that's 10% or 10 or 15% in a portfolio. It's an effective diversifier. I think the key at this time is we're going to become in a very risky environment, not just because of what we're talking about the debt, but we have a great deal of internal conflict between the left and the right and what's going on. We have a changing world order in which there's external conflict between countries. What is the world order like? And then we have other things developing. So I think we're going to be in a period of greater than normal risk. So when you start to think about what is the best portfolio that's a diversifier portfolio, the power of good diversification in reducing your risk without reducing your returns is a great power. So I would encourage the understanding of proper diversification with a bias to stay away or shy away from debt assets.
And what about equities then? Because if what you're talking about comes true, it feels like it would be very risky for all U.S. assets.
In real dollars, yes. It depends how bad it gets. If it gets to be like the 1970s, it would be bad for all the assets. But the gold portion, or maybe to some extent a Bitcoin, depending on where you're thinking, or whatever that inflation hedge asset, will then go up in that environment to provide some sort of a diversification. So if you have a balanced portfolio that way, and you get into a type of 70s, What happens for just depreciation of the currency up, if it's not a lot, it actually is supportive to equity prices. The problem right now is that if you look at equity valuations, they're relatively high in relation to bond valuations.
Yes.
That means if interest rates go up, it's bad. It's very bad for both of those markets. So the Fed will have to come in. But that diversification would be the main thing I would emphasize.
Well, Ray, it's great having you on the week that the book is out. It is a very timely conversation with what's happening in Washington right now. Thank you for the time.
Thank you for having me on.
Ray Dalio, book is How Countries Go Broke, the Big Cycle. And I've been told that lawmakers are taking a look at that. And I think that the discussion is live right now as they're talking about the big, beautiful bill and whether they have the political stomach to actually cut. I mean, you can't really cut those numbers unless you're talking about entitlements, Social Security, Medicare. That's tough stuff.
Right. There's the tax cuts, too. There's both the revenue side and the spending side.